The early morning mist clung to the dense pine forests surrounding Silver Creek, Montana. A chorus of birds greeted the rising sun, their melodies intertwining with the distant rumble of the river. But something foreign disrupted the serenity. A heavy, labored breath, followed by the slow, dragging shuffle of something massive moving through the underbrush. Emerging from the tree line was a grizzly bear, but not as the wilderness usually knew them. His once thick fur was weighed down by an unnatural burden, his movements hindered by grotesque, clinging masses. His body, majestic even in suffering, was nearly unrecognizable beneath the barnacle-like growths that clung to his flesh. A low, pained grunt escaped him as he stumbled forward, his enormous frame trembling under the weight of his torment. At first, the few early risers by the creek froze in fear. A bear this close to the water's edge, this close to civilization, was unusual. But as they took in his appearance, the fear turned to something else. Shock, confusion, and for some, profound pity. His fur, normally a proud mixture of deep brown and gold, was marred by clusters of hard, grayish-white shells that twisted and burrowed into his skin. His eyes, dim with exhaustion, flickered between wariness and desperation. Among the stunned witnesses was Dr. Noah Carter, a wildlife biologist who had spent the last decade studying grizzly populations in the northern Rockies. The sight before him defied anything he had encountered in his years of research. This wasn't a simple case of mange or parasites. This was something far worse. The barnacle-like formations weren't just on the bear's fur. They had taken root in his flesh, forming grotesque ridges along his powerful shoulders, down his back, and even across his face. Some of the clusters had cracked open, exposing raw, inflamed skin beneath. The mere act of moving must have been agony, and yet, against all odds, he had made his way to the riverbank. The onlookers whispered among themselves, some instinctively raising their phones to document the bizarre sight. Others backed away, uncertain of what the bear might do next. Dr. Carter, however, stepped forward cautiously, his heart hammering in his chest. The bear turned his massive head towards him, eyes locking onto the human in an almost knowing way. For a moment, neither moved. Then, the bear let out a deep, guttural exhale and collapsed onto the rocky shore. Dr. Carter didn't know it then, but this moment would mark the beginning of an unprecedented battle. One that would test the limits of science, compassion, and the sheer will to survive. A stunned silence fell over the riverbank. The bear's massive body lay motionless on the wet stones, his breath shallow but steady. For a creature of his size and strength to collapse like this, the burden he carried had to be unfathomable. Dr. Noah Carter took a slow step closer, his mind racing through possibilities. Was the bear starving? Sick? Poisoned? No, this was something else entirely. The barnacle-like clusters were unlike anything he had seen on a terrestrial mammal. They coated the bear's back in thick, grotesque formations, extending down his legs and even along the curve of his belly. Some of the hardened masses were the size of fists, their jagged edges digging into his skin. Others were smaller, clustered together in patches like unnatural armor. The worst ones had fused with his flesh, their sharp ridges embedded deep. Noah crouched a few feet away, scanning the bear's chest for movement. His breaths were slow but even, his ribs rising and falling beneath the grotesque shell that covered him. It was a miracle he had made it this far. The sheer weight of the growths must have slowed his every movement, making hunting and foraging nearly impossible. And yet, somehow, he had survived. People were still watching, murmuring in hushed voices. Someone was already on the phone with Montana Fish and Wildlife, but Noah knew this was beyond standard wildlife intervention. This was something new, something no ranger or veterinarian had ever dealt with before. A sharp voice cut through the whispers. "That bear's in agony. Someone needs to do something." Noah turned to see an older man in waders, likely a fisherman. His weathered face was a mixture of concern and unease. Others nodded in agreement. "I know," Noah replied. "But we can't just rush in. He's still a grizzly. If he feels threatened, even in this condition, he could lash out." The fisherman folded his arms. "Doesn't look like he's got the strength left to fight." That was the worst part. He might be right. Noah pulled out his radio. "This is Dr. Noah Carter, requesting immediate assistance at Silver Creek. I have a severely compromised grizzly bear, unknown external growths, possible infection. Send wildlife rescue and a veterinary team as soon as possible." Static crackled. Then a voice responded, "Copy that, Doctor." "Carter. Rangers are en route. ETA 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Noah turned his attention back to the bear. He had spent years working with grizzlies, but never like this. In all his studies, he had never seen anything remotely close to this condition. There were cases of sea turtles covered in barnacles after long stretches in the ocean. But a bear? How could this happen? He carefully observed the formations, noting how they followed the bear's muscle lines, particularly along his shoulders and spine. They hadn't just attached to his fur, they had grown into him. The weight of them alone would have been exhausting, but the constant irritation, the wounds beneath them, the infections that surely lurked under those crusted shells. This bear had been suffering for weeks, if not months. A sudden sound made him freeze. The bear let out a low, guttural groan. His head shifted slightly, his sunken eyes cracking open. Noah held his breath as those dark, exhausted eyes locked onto him. There was no aggression in them, no warning of danger, just pain. The bear was pleading. It was a moment Noah would never forget. 15 minutes later, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the valley. The rangers had arrived. A team of wildlife officers and veterinarians poured out of the trucks, led by Ranger Eva Langley, a woman Noah had worked with before. She took one look at the bear and swore under her breath. Jesus, what the hell happened to him? "That's what we need to figure out," Noah replied. "We need to sedate him and get him out of here. He won't survive much longer on his own." The team sprang into action, preparing a tranquilizer dart with the utmost care. The dosage had to be precise. Too little, and the bear could still thrash in pain. Too much, and they could put his already stressed body into shock. The dart was fired. The bear flinched as the needle sank into his muscle, but he didn't have the strength to resist. Within minutes, his breathing slowed, his body fully relaxing into the riverbank. Noah exhaled in relief. The hardest part was yet to come. With great care, the team approached the bear, checking vitals, assessing the extent of the damage. The veterinary specialist, Dr. Lillian Torres, knelt beside him, gently touching the barnacle-like clusters. "This is unreal," she murmured. "They're fused to his skin. Some of them have grown into his muscle tissue." Noah felt his stomach tighten. "Any idea what they are?" She shook her head. "Nothing I've seen on a land animal. They look like marine barnacles, but that doesn't make sense." Noah frowned. What if he was in the water for an extended period? Lillian considered it. Maybe, but long enough for these to form. It would have to be months, Noah said grimly. The pieces started to come together. The weight loss, the desperate trek to the river, the sheer exhaustion. This bear had been at sea. But how? "Let's get him loaded up," Eva said, breaking the silence. "We need to get him back to the facility before he wakes up." Transporting a full-grown grizzly was no easy task, especially one in such fragile condition. The team worked swiftly, using a reinforced stretcher to carefully lift him onto the bed of a transport truck. Even unconscious, the bear's presence was intimidating. But what haunted Noah most was how unnaturally still he was. It took nearly an hour to get back to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in Kalispell. During the drive, Noah kept replaying the situation in his mind, trying to understand how a bear could end up covered in something that should only exist on ocean creatures. As they arrived at the facility, the team wasted no time setting up an examination room large enough to accommodate the massive patient. Under the bright clinical lights, the full horror of his condition became undeniable. The barnacles, if that's what they were, covered nearly 70% of his body. His skin was raw and inflamed beneath them, some areas showing deep lesions where the growths had cut into him. Some formations had built upon each other, creating grotesque, knotted ridges across his back. The smell of salt and decay lingered in the air. "This isn't just a medical emergency," Lillian said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is something we've never seen before." As Noah stood over the sedated bear, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. What had this bear survived? And more importantly, how had he made it back at all? The steady beep of the monitor filled the sterile air of the rehabilitation center. Under the glow of surgical lamps, the bear's massive form lay motionless on the reinforced examination table, his chest rising and falling in a slow, drug-induced rhythm. Noah, Lillian, and the rest of the veterinary team stood over him, their faces a mix of awe and concern. They had sedated and treated grizzlies before, but never like this. Noah ran a gloved hand over the thick clusters embedded in the bear's skin, his fingertips brushing against the rough, barnacle-like formations. Some had fused so deeply into his flesh that removing them carelessly could tear his muscle apart. The barnacles varied in size, some small enough to be mistaken for thick scabs, others grotesquely large, like jagged stones welded to his back. "How the hell does this happen to a bear?" Lillian murmured as she prepared a scalpel. Noah exhaled sharply. "I was thinking the same thing. The only logical explanation is prolonged exposure to seawater. But for how long, and how did he get there?" Eva Langley, standing nearby with her arms crossed, let out a slow whistle. "We're talking months, right? But bears don't just take ocean vacations. What are we missing?" No one had an answer. Lillian adjusted her gloves. "All right, let's start small. I'll try removing one of the less embedded ones first." She positioned the scalpel against a smaller barnacle cluster near the bear's shoulder. With slow, precise movements, she applied pressure, easing the blade between the growth and the skin. The moment she lifted, a thick, clear liquid oozed from the exposed wound. Noah leaned in. "That's not normal. It's not pus," Lillian confirmed. "It's almost saline?" Eva's brow furrowed. "As in seawater?" Noah exchanged a glance with Lillian. This bear hadn't just been exposed to the ocean. It had been submerged for an extended period, long enough that his body had absorbed the very essence of it. The implications were staggering. Lillian continued working, carefully detaching another small barnacle. This time, the removal triggered a weak reaction. The bear's paw twitched slightly. His sedation was still holding, but even unconscious, his body registered the pain. Noah clenched his jaw. "We need to find a way to remove them that doesn't cause trauma. If they've rooted this deep, ripping them off could be just as bad as leaving them on." Lillian nodded. "Agreed. If we don't do this right, we could trigger hemorrhaging or worse." Noah ran a hand through his hair, glancing at the larger formations along the bear's back. Some of them had calcified into jagged plates, like armor. Others looked like they had merged into the bear's very biology. His body had adapted to their presence, but it wasn't meant to. A creeping thought entered his mind. What if the bear had been floating in the ocean for weeks, maybe even months? His fur's too thick for barnacle larvae to latch onto normally, Noah muttered. But if he was in the water long enough, and if his body was weak, they might have settled into any open wounds or thinning patches of fur. Eva gave him a skeptical look. Are you saying this guy was just drifting out there for months? Noah's mind spun through possibilities. What if he fell from a fishing vessel, or got trapped on a broken ice floe and was carried out to sea? Or worse, Eva added grimly, what if he was deliberately abandoned? The room fell silent. It wasn't unheard of for illegal poachers to capture wild animals and transport them over long distances. If something had gone wrong, or if the bear had been discarded, dumped into the ocean like unwanted cargo, this might have been the horrific result. Lillian cleared her throat. No matter how he got there, one thing is certain. He shouldn't have survived. And yet, against all logic, he had. The team spent the next several hours carefully strategizing how to remove the barnacles without causing undue harm. After multiple tests, they discovered that soaking the clusters in a specialized saline solution loosened their grip slightly, making them easier to detach. The process was painstakingly slow. Each growth had to be evaluated individually. Some could be carefully extracted with forceps, while others required surgical precision. Every removal revealed fresh wounds beneath, some so deep they exposed muscle. We'll need antibiotics immediately, Lillian said as she examined a particularly large lesion near the bear's ribs. These wounds have been festering under the shells for who knows how long. Noah nodded. We also need to keep his hydration levels up. If he was drinking seawater to survive, his kidneys are going to be in bad shape. As the hours passed, the bear's body gradually began to look more like a grizzly again. The barnacles along his back were the worst. Some had to be partially broken down before removal to prevent excessive bleeding. Each growth removed felt like peeling away months of suffering, layer by painful layer. Then they encountered their first major setback. Noah was working on a particularly stubborn cluster along the bear's hind leg when the monitor suddenly let out an alarming beep. Lillian's head snapped up, heart rate's dropping. Damn it, Noah muttered. He's going into stress shock. Eva rushed to grab an IV bag, while another vet adjusted the sedation levels. The bear's breathing had slowed dangerously, his body reacting to the trauma of the removals. Noah clenched his fists. We need to slow down. Lillian gritted her teeth. If we slow down too much, the infections could worsen. They were walking a razor's edge, too fast, and they risked sending the bear into full shock. Too slow, and the lingering barnacle wounds could become septic. The team made the difficult choice to stop for the night, stabilizing the bear and giving his body time to recover. The remaining barnacles would have to wait. As Noah stepped outside to get some air, he stared up at the Montana night sky, the stars shining brightly over the darkened wilderness. How had this happened? And more importantly, what kind of strength did it take for this bear to survive such an ordeal? As he listened to the distant sounds of the forest, one thing became clear. This was just the beginning. Dawn broke over the Montana wilderness in soft shades of gold and violet, but inside the rehabilitation center there was no peace, only the quiet hum of medical monitors and the tension of uncertainty. Noah had barely slept. He sat outside the bear's enclosure, sipping stale coffee, his mind still racing. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the barnacle-ridden creature dragging itself onto the riverbank. its breath ragged, its body failing. The bear, whom the team had started calling Titan, had survived the night. That alone was a small miracle, but the hardest part was still ahead. Noah stood and stretched, stepping inside to check on him. Titan lay on the padded floor of the specialized Grizzly enclosure, his massive body rising and falling in slow, deep breaths. The sedation had mostly worn off, but his exhaustion ran deeper than the drugs. He hadn't stirred much, and Noah wasn't sure if it was because of lingering pain or sheer depletion. Lillian entered the room behind him, carrying a clipboard. Vitals are stable, but his temperature's still low. And he's dehydrated. I'm worried about kidney function. Noah nodded, his gaze fixed on Titan's barely open eyes. He's been through hell, but if he made it this far, he's not giving up yet. Titan let out a slow, rasping breath, shifting slightly. Even that small movement made him flinch, his exposed wound still raw from the removal of the first layer of barnacles. Lillian sighed. I've been thinking about something. Noah turned to her. Yeah? She hesitated before continuing. If he was in the ocean long enough for this to happen, he must have been surviving on something. If he was close to shore, he might have scavenged. But if he was out in open water, Noah caught on immediately. He would have had to swim for his life. They both stared at the bear in silent astonishment. Grizzlies were strong swimmers, but there were limits. No land mammal was meant to withstand prolonged exposure to ocean currents, let alone for weeks or months. And yet, Titan had. Somehow, against all odds, he had kept moving. Eva entered the room then, rubbing her eyes from lack of sleep. We need a plan for today. We can't keep stopping the removal process, but we also can't push him too far. Noah exhaled. Let's focus on two things: removing the most dangerous barnacles first and managing his pain. Agreed. Lillian tapped her clipboard. But we need more help. I've put out feelers to marine biologists. Someone out there might have seen something like this before. Noah nodded. Good, because I have a feeling we're dealing with something entirely new. By midday, the team resumed their work. The saline soak method had shown the most promise, so they refined the process, keeping Titan's exposed wounds hydrated while loosening the barnacle grip. The removals were slow, delicate, and agonizing to watch. Every time they peeled away another cluster, a fresh wound was revealed, some deeper than expected. Titan twitched occasionally, his body instinctively reacting to the discomfort, but he remained eerily cooperative, as if he knew the humans were trying to help him. Lillian worked on a particularly stubborn patch along his left flank. These are fused deeper than the others, she muttered. I think some of them might have actually altered his muscle structure. Noah leaned in. You're saying his body started adapting to them? Maybe not adapting, more like compensating. She pointed to the ridges along his shoulders. See this? These muscles should be more developed. But it looks like the weight of the barnacles forced him to move differently, shifting the way his body carried itself. Noah ran a hand down his face. Jesus. He wasn't just suffering. He was adjusting, surviving. The implications were staggering. What a Titan had endured wasn't just a freak accident. His body had undergone a forced transformation, fighting to maintain balance and mobility under a growing, living burden. The thought made Noah sick. Eva adjusted an IV bag. We need to run full blood work soon. If his system was fighting off this level of invasion, there might be deeper damage. Titan let out a soft, huffing noise. Less a growl, more of an exhausted sigh. Hang in there, big guy, Noah muttered. As the afternoon stretched on, a breakthrough finally arrived. Lillian had been testing different mixtures of saline and medical compounds, trying to find a way to weaken the barnacle's hold without harming Titan. After nearly a dozen failed trials, one mixture showed an unexpected reaction. The barnacles loosened slightly on their own. Noah watched closely as Lillian applied the solution to a small patch near Titan's hind leg. Within minutes, the rough, stone-like formations began to detach with minimal resistance. "Holy shit," Eva breathed. "That's working." Lillian grinned. "It's not just softening them. It's disrupting their attachment points. They're letting go." Noah felt a surge of hope. If they could refine this method, they might be able to remove the rest without risking Titan's health. They worked late into the night, carefully applying the new treatment, watching as more barnacles detached. It was a slow, painstaking process, but for the first time, there was real progress. By midnight, nearly 30% of the remaining clusters had been removed. Titan was still weak, but his breathing was more stable. His body, once entombed in a grotesque prison of barnacles, was slowly beginning to look like a grizzly again. Noah sat back, exhaustion washing over him. "He's fighting. He's really fighting." Lillian nodded, brushing a hand over Titan's unburdened fur. "And so are we." By the next morning, a call came in from one of Lillian's marine biology contacts. A researcher in Alaska had seen something similar on sea lions. They documented cases where certain parasites caused barnacle-like formations to grow on weakened animals lost at sea, Lillian explained. But those were marine mammals. Nothing like this has ever been recorded on a bear. Noah frowned. Could Titan have picked up something out there? Some kind of marine parasite that altered his biology? "We don't know," Lillian admitted. "But if he did, we might be dealing with something entirely new." A heavy silence fell over them. Titan wasn't just a rescue case anymore. He was an anomaly, a biological mystery that could rewrite everything they knew about survival in extreme conditions. And they were running out of time to solve it. The morning sun cast long shadows over the rehabilitation center, its golden light spilling through the clinic's reinforced windows. Inside, Titan lay stretched out on his padded enclosure, his massive frame showing the battle scars of the previous day's procedures. His body, once hidden beneath a grotesque shell of barnacle-like formations, was finally beginning to emerge, raw and wounded, but unmistakably grisly again. Noah sat nearby, staring at his clipboard, but his mind wasn't on the medical charts. The revelation from the Alaskan researcher still gnawed at him. If sea lions had experienced similar conditions, that meant Titan's case wasn't entirely unique. Something in the ocean, some parasite, some environmental factor, had triggered this. But why had it taken hold so aggressively on a bear? And more importantly, had it left any lasting damage? Titan let out a deep, groggy exhale, shifting slightly. The movement sent a ripple through his exposed skin, still tender from the removals. He was awake, but sluggish, his body caught in the space between exhaustion and healing. Lillian entered the room, holding a tablet loaded with the latest lab results. The look on her face wasn't reassuring. "Tell me something good," Noah said. Lillian sighed. "I'd love to, but his blood work's a mess. High infection markers, dangerously low white blood cell count, and..." She hesitated. Noah sat up straighter. "And what?" She handed him the tablet. "Look at this." Noah scrolled through the data, his eyes catching on one particularly disturbing anomaly. Salt levels in Titan's system were still dangerously high. "Wait," he muttered, scanning the numbers again. "He hasn't been in seawater for days. Why is his system still retaining this much salt?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Lillian said, rubbing her temples. "Even with IV hydration, his body isn't flushing it out fast enough. It's almost like his biology adapted to it." Noah's stomach twisted. You're saying his body isn't just recovering from saltwater exposure. It's holding on to it? Lillian nodded grimly. Like a marine mammal. The words sent a chill through the room. Titan hadn't just survived the ocean. He had changed because of it. Noah paced outside the clinic, his phone pressed to his ear. He was on his third call that morning, desperately reaching out to any specialist who might have insight into what was happening to Titan. Salt retention like this in a land mammal? Came the skeptical voice of Dr. Elias Grant, a leading veterinary researcher. That's unheard of. That's what I thought, Noah said, pinching the bridge of his nose. But I have the data right in front of me. His system is behaving like he's still in a marine environment. Dr. Grant was silent for a moment. Then he said something that made Noah stop in his tracks. If that's true, you might be dealing with something evolutionary. Noah's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Dr. Grant hesitated. There have been rare cases of land mammals developing short-term physiological adaptations to extreme environments, things like increased lung capacity at high altitudes or desert animals retaining water better. But a bear showing signs of marine adaptation, that's beyond anything I've ever heard of. Noah's mind raced. Could this explain how Titan had survived for so long at sea? Had his body undergone some kind of emergency adaptation to process salt water and keep him afloat? If his body thinks it still needs to retain salt, Noah said slowly, then it might also be suppressing his natural recovery process. He's stuck in survival mode. That would explain why he's not stabilizing, Dr. Grant agreed. If you want to save him, you need to break that cycle. Noah exhaled, his heart hammering. Titan wasn't just fighting external trauma. He was trapped in an altered biological state, and they had to bring him back before his body shut down completely. Noah stormed back into the clinic, his mind made up. We need to force his system to reset. Lillian frowned. What do you mean? We need to mimic the environment his body thinks it's in, Noah explained. Then slowly reintroduce him to normal conditions so his body starts functioning properly again. Ava, who had been listening nearby, crossed her arms. Are you saying we need to make him think he's still at sea? In a controlled way, yes. Noah nodded. If we can slowly adjust his hydration, temperature, and oxygen levels, we might be able to trigger his system into recognizing that it's safe to return to normal. Lillian's eyes widened. That's actually brilliant. The team immediately sprang into action. First, they adjusted Titan's IV fluids, carefully lowering the saline concentration to gradually reduce his dependency on high salt levels. Next, they modified his enclosure, adjusting temperature and humidity to mimic a shoreline environment. They even introduced a saltwater pool, allowing him to engage with the element his body had become accustomed to, but on their terms. Over the next several hours, the team monitored his response. At first, there was little change. Titan remained sluggish, barely reacting to his environment. But then, subtle signs of improvement. His breathing became deeper. His hydration levels stabilized. His heart rate showed signs of normalizing. By evening, Titan did something he hadn't done since his arrival. He stood up. It was slow, unsteady. His legs trembled beneath his massive weight. But the sight of him rising, of shaking out his fur like a real grizzly again, sent a wave of emotion through the room. The war wasn't over, but Titan had taken his first real step toward reclaiming his life. Later that night, as the clinic quieted, Noah sat beside Titan's enclosure, watching the bear as he rested. His eyes were still weary, but there was something else in them now, something aware. Titan was coming back. The last pieces of the mystery were falling into place, but one question remained. How had he ended up in the ocean to begin with? That answer came the following morning. Ava burst into the clinic, phone in hand. "You're going to want to see this." She handed Noah her phone, where a grainy video played on the screen. It had been taken weeks ago by a fishing crew off the Alaskan coast. Noah's blood ran cold as he watched. The footage showed a massive, struggling shape floating among the waves. It was hard to see at first, but then, Titan. A haunting roar echoed over the water as he fought to stay afloat. And behind him, barely visible through the mist, a cargo ship. The realization hit Noah like a punch to the gut. Titan hadn't just drifted into the ocean. He had been thrown in. Noah replayed the grainy video again, his jaw tightening with each passing second. The footage was shaky, likely taken from a fishing vessel, but there was no mistaking the massive form struggling in the waves. Titan. The ocean had swallowed him whole, his body bobbing and thrashing as he fought to stay afloat. But it wasn't the sight of the bear that sent a chill through Noah's spine. It was the cargo ship in the background. Eva leaned over his shoulder, arms crossed. Someone dumped him. Noah exhaled sharply, his hands curling into fists. This wasn't an accident. He didn't just fall overboard. He was thrown. Lillian, who had just entered the room, frowned. Who would do something like that? Eva shook her head. That's what we need to find out. The video ended, leaving them in silence. Noah turned to Eva. Where was this taken? 200 miles off the Alaskan coast, she replied. The boat that took the footage was fishing for halibut. They spotted Titan drifting near a shipping lane, but by the time they tried to get closer, he was already being pulled away by the current. Noah swore under his breath. Titan had survived something no land mammal should have endured. If he had been dumped that far out at sea, there was no way he should have made it back to shore. The fact that he had fought his way through freezing waters, starvation, and parasitic infestation for weeks, maybe months, was almost impossible to comprehend. Lillian crossed her arms. Do we have any way of identifying the ship? Eva scrolled through her phone. I'm working on it. The footage was uploaded to a marine conservation forum, and some people are already analyzing the markings on the hull. If we're lucky, we'll get an ID soon. Noah turned back to Titan's enclosure, watching as the bear shifted, his eyes half-lidded but aware. He had been through hell, and someone had sent him there. The question was, why? By midday, the mystery of Titan's origins had begun unraveling at an alarming pace. Eva returned with more information, her face grim. We got a match on the cargo ship. Noah straightened. Who owns it? She handed him a printed report. It's registered to a private shipping company based out of Russia. And guess what? They've been flagged before for illegally transporting exotic animals. Lillian's eyes widened. Wait, are you saying Titan was cargo? Noah scanned the report, his pulse quickening. The shipping company had been investigated multiple times for moving endangered species under false permits. Big cats, primates, even bears. But no arrests had ever been made. They must have been smuggling him, Noah muttered. Maybe they planned to sell him, or maybe he was part of some illegal breeding operation, but something went wrong. Eva nodded. Exactly. Maybe he got too aggressive. Maybe they realized he was too much of a liability. Either way, they decided to get rid of him the easiest way possible. They threw him into the ocean. Lillian finished, horror dawning on her face. Noah's stomach churned. He looked back at Titan, at the scars left behind by his ordeal. The barnacles were almost gone now, but the wounds ran deeper than his skin. He had been stolen from his home, trapped, discarded like trash, and then forced to fight for his life in a world where he didn't belong. And he had won. The next few days were crucial. Titan was stabilizing, but he was still dangerously weak. His hydration levels were improving, and the gradual reduction of salt in his system was showing positive results. But the psychological damage was harder to gauge. He didn't respond aggressively to humans. If anything, he had remained eerily calm since his rescue. It wasn't submission, and it wasn't fear. It was something else. Resignation. Like he had seen the worst the world had to offer and simply endured it. Noah had seen that look before, in rescued animals, in war survivors, in people who had fought for too long and weren't sure how to stop. "He's not just physically recovering," Noah muttered as he watched Titan sleep. "He's learning how to live again." Lillian sighed. "It's going to take time. We'll give him as much as he needs." For the first time since Titan's arrival, Noah felt something other than fear for the bear's survival. He felt hope, but even as Titan recovered, the fight wasn't over. The illegal wildlife trade was a global monster, one that destroyed thousands of animal lives every year. If Titan had been part of an operation that large, it meant there were others still suffering. And Noah wasn't about to let that go. Ava's connections in conservation groups had already started tracking down the shipping company's movements. Authorities were beginning to take an interest, and with the viral attention Titan's story was getting, pressure was mounting. Noah watched Titan from the observation deck, his heart heavy but determined. This bear had been discarded, left to die in the most brutal way possible. But he had fought back. He had survived. And now his survival was going to mean something. Because Noah wasn't just going to save Titan, he was going to make sure this never happened again. Titan's story had already spread across conservation circles, but when news outlets picked up the details, a grizzly bear found covered in barnacle-like growths, dumped in the middle of the ocean, and somehow surviving against all odds, it exploded. Within days, national and international media were reporting on Titan. His before and after images went viral. Animal rights organizations called for investigations. Social media flooded with messages of outrage and support. And most importantly, people started asking questions. The pressure mounted on law enforcement, and soon international agencies were involved. Wildlife trafficking was a billion-dollar industry, and if Titan had been part of it, he wasn't the only one. Ava slammed a printed report onto the table in their e-research office. Interpol just flagged the shipping company. Noah's stomach flipped. "They found something?" "More than something," she said. "They raided a facility in Eastern Europe, found cages, big ones. DNA samples match multiple bears." Noah went rigid. "Grizzlies?" "Some, but also Asiatic black bears, Siberian browns, even cubs." Lillian swore under her breath. They were farming them. The reality was sickening. Some of the bears were likely sold for private collections, others for canned hunts, some for body parts, bile farms, illegal fur trades, the worst of it. Titan had been lucky. If he hadn't fought, if they hadn't discarded him into the ocean, he would have been one of them. Noah felt his fists clench. "Do they have names, owners, someone we can go after?" Eva smirked. "The company's already trying to distance itself, but the authorities are working fast. There have been arrests." She tapped the report. "If we keep pushing, we can help shut this down." For the first time, Noah felt like this fight wasn't just about saving Titan, it was about avenging him. Even as the legal battle unfolded, Titan's personal battle wasn't over. His recovery had reached a turning point. The barnacles were gone, the wounds healing. His salt levels had balanced. His muscle mass, once depleted from malnutrition, was starting to return. But he had spent too long in survival mode. The hardest part wasn't getting Titan's body back to full strength. It was getting him to remember who he was. So Noah and his team did something radical. They took Titan outside. It was a risk. He was still weak, and any setback could undo months of work. But he needed to feel the earth beneath his paws again. The enclosure's massive gates opened to a controlled section of the wilderness, lined with dense pine trees and rolling hills. Titan, still groggy, sniffed the air, and for the first time his ears perked. He recognized it, the forest, the smell of damp earth, pine needles, distant water, home. He took his first step slowly, uncertain, but then his massive shoulders rolled, his spine stretched, and he moved, not like a victim, not like a survivor, like a grizzly, a real grizzly. Noah watched from a distance, his throat tight. "He's remembering," Lillian whispered. Titan lumbered toward a tree, his nose twitching as he sniffed the bark. His claws flexed, testing the ground. And then, in one slow, deliberate movement, he rose onto his hind legs. He stretched his limbs high, scratching against the bark, marking his place. It was the first sign of wild instinct they had seen since his arrival. And it was everything. Weeks passed. Titan grew stronger. His walks turned into runs. His cautious movements became confident. He stopped looking to the humans for guidance and started looking to the trees, the sky, the rivers. It was time. The day of Titan's release was one of mixed emotions. They had saved him, fought for him, given him back the life that had been stolen. But now they had to let him go. They transported him deep into the protected lands of Glacier National Park, a place where Grizzly still ruled, where the wilderness stretched for miles untouched. As the gate to his transport cage opened, Titan hesitated for only a moment. Then, with the strength he had fought so hard to reclaim, he stepped forward. The team stood in silence as Titan made his way into the wild. He didn't look back, he didn't need to, because he was free. Truly, finally free. Titan's story didn't end there. The arrests continued. The illegal trade operation collapsed under media scrutiny and law enforcement pressure. More animals were rescued, some too broken to be released, but others given a second chance. And Titan? His legend grew. Hikers reported sightings of a massive grizzly in Glacier, one with faint scars along his back but a full, healthy coat now gleaming in the sun. He was seen near riverbanks, catching fish, rolling in meadows, rubbing his massive shoulders against trees, marking his territory like the king he was meant to be. The bear that had survived the impossible. The bear that had fought back. Noah never saw Titan again after that day, but sometimes when the wind howled through the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and earth and something ancient, he liked to think Titan was out there, wild, free, exactly as he was always meant to be.